In this lesson, we're going to talk about evolution. So to begin with, let's define what we mean by evolution. So evolution refers to a change in a population over time. So we're referring to changes that accumulate in a population over generations. From one generation to the next, this change is passed on. So we say it's a change in a population or a group of organisms that all belong to the same species. And that's very specific because we don't say that an individual evolves. All right. It is the population that evolves. So we have to see that change spread from one individual to another. And it has to be some type of change that can be inherited or can be passed on. So like if you pierce your ears, obviously that's not something that's going to be passed on to the next generation. You don't have babies that are born with pierced ears. So it has to be something that's at the level of the DNA. So we're looking for a change that happens within the DNA, and we usually refer to this as a mutation, right? And we've discussed what mutations are when we talked about transcription and translation, and we saw how we could have a silent mutation, or what happens when you have a base pair substitution or insertion and deletion, and how that affects the protein that's being produced. So the ultimate source of these changes that can spread through a population have their basis in DNA mutations. Now, the power behind evolution is what we call natural selection. So this is how we believe that change in a population comes about. So natural selection happens in nature when individuals with traits that are better suited to that particular environment, these individuals survive, right? So that they're not eaten by a predator or anything like that. They're well camouflaged. They're able to maybe outrun their predator or at least escape a predator, and therefore they get to reproduce, right? You get to live, you get to reproduce. So it could not, maybe it's not just predators. Maybe they're able to find sufficient food, sufficient resources, and they reproduce. So whatever it is that made them more successful than other members is going to hopefully be passed on as long as it's DNA based. And over many generations, we see that these advantageous traits become more common in the population. Right? So it says whoever has the most kids wins. And that's kind of what natural selection is about, right? Because you are passing on these successful characteristics to the next generation. So as long as you reproduce, you're at least passing it on. If you have a lot of offspring, then you're passing it on to a lot of individuals, and they may go on and reproduce more as well. So these successful characteristics we can then see start to spread through the population over generations, right? So if an individual is not very successful at obtaining resources or finding mates, then they don't reproduce as much, right? Or may not reproduce, and therefore their characteristics are not going to be passed on to the next generation. All right, so once again, when we talk about evolution, we're talking about what happens over time in a population, not in an individual. And natural selection is believed to be one of the processes that is behind this. So we have a well-known example of natural selection that's been observed in the peppered moth. So these are moths that you can see. These are peppered moths. And during the Industrial Revolution in England, they started to see some changes in the peppered moths. So before the industrialization, most peppered moths had very light colored wings, and that helped them to blend in with the very pale bark of trees. These trees most of the time were covered in lichen, which made them very pale in color, and that helped to protect them from predators like birds. So because they were well camouflaged, they were not eaten. So you can see the lighter one on this lichen colored background is well camouflaged. But as more and more factories were built and the factories were releasing a lot of soot and pollution into the air, the trees became darkened with all that soot. And the lighter colored moths became much more visible, which is what you're seeing on the right-hand side. Now the lighter colored moth is not so well camouflaged. So there are other variants, right, that could arise by DNA mutation. So we have darker colored moths that were much better camouflage against the soot-covered surfaces and therefore had a higher chance of survival and reproduction. And over time, the population shifted so that the dark moths became far more common than the white moths. So before the Industrial Revolution, the light-colored moths were the ones that survived. After the soot covered the trees, we see the light-colored moths were no longer favored, and they were found by predators and eaten, and that shifted the population to the darker colored moths. So this is a clear example of natural selection at work, right? Whoever gets to survive gets to reproduce and pass on their genes. And then they saw later, when pollution levels started to decrease and the trees starting to become lighter again, that the light-colored moths regained their advantage. All right, so we can see how environmental changes can also directly influence which traits are favored in a population. Now, in contrast to natural selection, there's what's called artificial selection, and this occurs when humans intentionally breed organisms for specific traits that they find desirable. This process does not necessarily improve the organism's survival in the wild, right? But it rather meets our needs, our preferences, right? So that's why we go through it. So there's certain traits that we deem are desirable that we want to see within these organisms, and therefore we crossbreed them so that they have these desirable characteristics. So once again, it doesn't make them better fit for an environment. It's just for what we want. So we use what's called selective breeding. We choose which individuals get to breed together so that those characteristics we desire can be passed on. So we have selectively bred dogs for different traits, such as the size of the dog, the coat color of the dog, even animal behavior, the dog's behavior. We've done it with cows so that we can have cows that produce more milk. We do it with plants all the time, with roses, so we get ones with certain scents, certain colors, more petals. So all of this is considered to be artificial selection. So your book gives you the example of artificial selection with dogs, right? So having an ancestor that was the gray wolf, and then over time you can start to see the myriad of different shapes, sizes, their faces, and different characteristics that were deemed to be desirable. So this is all part of artificial selection. Now, while both processes involve selection and inheritance, right? Passing things on, natural selection is the one that's driven by environmental pressures, right? And artificial selection is guided by human choice. So now we come upon the term adaptation. So an adaptation is a heritable trait or characteristic that helps an organism survive and reproduce in its specific environment, right? So adaptations usually develop over many generations through the process of natural selection. So individuals with advantageous traits are more likely to survive and pass on their traits to their offspring. So adaptations can be structural, such as having thick fur as polar bears to help insulate them from the cold. They could be behavioral, like birds migrating to warmer climates during the winter. It could be physiological, such as certain animals being able to conserve water that live in the desert. So these traits basically increase the organism's so-called fitness, its ability to live and reproduce and ensure its genes continue on into future generations. So in this way, adaptations are kind of key to how species evolve and thrive in changing environments. So it says, compare and contrast artificial selection and natural selection and name 2 ways in which they are similar and how they are different. So if you want to pause the video for this moment and see if you can answer that question. If not, I will go right ahead. So artificial selection, right, and natural selection are both processes in which characteristics are passed on to the next generation. Desirable characteristics are passed on to the next generation and eventually may spread through the population. So whoever gets to reproduce is the one that's passing on their desirable characteristics. In artificial selection, humans are doing the selecting. In natural selection, it's the environment really that is causing, is kind of deciding, in a sense, who gets to pass on their characteristics if they're best suited to that particular environment. Now we have one more question here. So it says, which of the following illustrates evolution by natural selection? So once again, you can pause the video to see if you can choose whether it's A, B, or C. All right, let's go over the answers. So it says Shonda grew up in a hot climate of Louisiana. 5 years ago, she moved to the Colorado mountains and has gotten used to the cold weather. So Shonda is now used to cold weather. Has she evolved? Right? Evolution by natural selection. Once again, evolution is not about an individual, it's about a population. So A is not correct. Many people living in the high altitude, oxygen poor region of Tibet have a gene mutation that increases their blood oxygen supply. All right, so here we're talking about gene mutation. We said the ultimate source has to be based in DNA, and that's also an issue with Shonda, right? So that's good, and it's talking about many people. So that looks really good right there. How about C? 10 years ago, Jacinda could run only a half kilometer. She has been training for years and this year successfully ran a marathon. So once again, we're talking about just one individual, and that's just strengthening your muscles. That is not necessarily something that could be passed on to the next generation. So B is our correct answer here.